Right. Okay. Welcome, everybody. This is the LUNN seminar series. I'm very happy to see and welcome César. César was one of our colleagues at Loughborough University. Now he moved at LSE. Not competition. We know that Loughborough is better. Anyhow, some people sometimes decide to go down to London. Anyhow, it's a pleasure for me to introduce César. César Jiménez Martínez is an assistant professor in the Department of Media and Communication, now at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He has studied extensively the relationship between nation and media, or what is called the mediation of nationhood, pay particular attention to the notion of nation branding, and then also digital nationalism, and more recently also engaging with the protest at the national state level. He is the author of Media and the Image of the Nation during the Brazil's 2013 protest and the co-author of Nation Branding in the Americas. And more recently, he has been received a very prestigious award, the Anthony D. Smith Award, together with our colleague Sabina Mihaly. So congratulations to both. Well done. And today, Cesar is going to talk about politics and national promotion, nation branding and state power in Latin America. So I see that everybody already has the cameras closed. It's great. So we're going to talk about 30 or so minutes for Cesar's presentation, and then will be time for Q&A. So I'm also closing the camera, and yeah, cameras closing, microphone closing. So the floor is for you, Cesar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marco, for the introduction. And you said, well, not everyone is lucky enough to work at Loughborough. So thank you and I have great memories of the time I was there. Also, thank you for everyone who's here, especially Michael and Sabina. I'm really, really thankful that you are here. So you should be able now to look at the slides. As Marco, let me know if at some point there is any issue. But what I'm going to present today is something that emerged from a series of observations of a little book in which I collaborated with Efe Sevin and Pablo Miño. And this is something that we didn't develop on that book. This was an afterthought that came after we had finished and it was printed and everything, which is about the relationship between politics and nation branding, which one of the points that I'm going to make is how it's something that it has not been that much explored in the literature, because it's the economic arguments that have been prioritized. This is a slide just for the few people who don't know me, and that basically I've been following very much on the steps of the work of Sabina and Michael, trying to explore the relationship of the media and the nation. And one of the areas in which I focus to explore that relationship is in nation branding. And I feel it's a very productive area in which one can see some of the issues, tensions, contradictions, and many interesting facets that emerge from that relationship. So two warnings. I think the first one is that this is a work in progress, and this is a paper that I've been co-writing with Pablo Miño. Pablo Miño is a Chilean academic that he's based now at Universidad de los Andes in Santiago, and he has been very helpful with many of the data that I'm going to be showing you, and we have been talking about some ideas on this. So the first thing is that why I'm focusing on nation branding, and talking about nation branding is talking about a discipline and a practice, I would say much more than a discipline, that emerges in the late 1990s. The origin of histories of nation branding usually mentions a paper that you can see there called Nation Brands of the 21st Century, written by Simon Anholt, a British brand consultant, in which the argument of that paper was very much that was an extension of there is already something called the country of origin effect. That's the argument. I'm not saying that I share those arguments. That means that people associate certain products and the quality of those products with specific places. That people think that German cars are good, that coffee from Colombia is good, etc., etc. And therefore, there should be an extension that talking not only about products, but also nation states themselves should be treated like brands. And he was not the only person doing those arguments at that time. Similarly, Wally Ollins, another British brand consultant, at that time was also making the argument that basically branding was a logic that could be applied to everything in society. So in the same way that one could talk about the branding of products, then the branding of corporation, the branding of individuals, and why not the branding of nation states? In fact, he has a paper in which he argues that the French Revolution was basically a rebranding of France, and again a very disputed argument in my view, but that is the perspective. But this was not only a viewpoint of people working in marketing and branding, but also a few years later, Peter van Ham, a political scientist, wrote a series of articles, one of them called The Rise of the Brand State, in which one of the points that he was making, all this at the peak of neoliberal globalization, of course, one of the points that he was making was that how traditional politics at that time were being replaced by branding and brand politics. And he said in one of his pieces that branding was going to facilitate what he called was an era of much more benign nationalism, in which instead of having armed conflicts, there was going to be competition in the market. Of course, a very wrong prediction, as we can see nowadays, but it tells you a little bit of the origins of nation branding. And from there, from that series of papers, articles, discussions, the practice of nation branding extended very quickly, especially in the early 2000s. This map is a little bit outdated because several of these logos have already changed, but you can see how the idea that countries, nation states must have a brand became very much naturalized across the Americas, Europe, Asia, several places in Africa. This was not random, so there was the work of many of these consultants, like Simon Anholt, Bollins, and others that started touring countries and making the case of why nation branding was an inevitable necessity, but also several universities. Very famously, the University of Southern California has a program on public diplomacy, which overlaps a lot with nation branding, and in which they have made the case of why countries must work and must invest in this idea of communicating versions of national identity. This is not purely an academic discussion. I find very interesting how, alongside with the money that has been invested by governments in national branding, there have been a lot of rankings that have emerged several years. Some of them do not exist anymore. Some of them remain. Currently, perhaps the most relevant one is the Global Soft Power Index of Brand Finance, in which they claim to measure the national brands of around 150 nation states around the world. They used to do a big event in London every year, but this year, for the first time, they moved it to Davos. So that also shows you that the weight that is given to that. The speakers that they have, I attended to a couple of years ago, and Boris Johnson was the main speaker, but they have also Lech Wałęsa and another year and so on. But that's one of several other brand rankings, like the Nation Brand Index and so on and so on. The details of these rankings, even though they claim to be neutral and scientific, have been disputed within academia, but still they are used to justify policies and politics around the world. I remember how, for instance, the Olympics in London, where the money that was spent on them was partly justified because the UK moved a couple of places up in that ranking. And similarly, when there has been like a crisis in a country, sometimes one of the measurements that they used to criticize is say like, oh, we move in this nation branding or soft power or whatever kind of ranking a little lower. So again, it's not purely an academic discussion, but it's something that has permeated politics and decisions, and again, some of the decisions that are justified based on this ranking supposedly neutral. But what is nation branding? And there are plenty of contested definitions of the term. Even some of the more instrumental literature on nation branding doesn't agree on what nation branding is exactly. Partly also because it overlaps with many other practices and terms. So there is the country of origin effect that I mentioned. People in marketing talk about destination marketing, which focuses on tourism. There's also public diplomacy. There's soft power. There is propaganda. But then I wonder to what extent does that those debates actually matter? Because quite often, especially when I'm talking to students or with early career scholars, they want to know, for instance, what is the exact difference between public diplomacy and nation branding? And I don't think that is a very interesting question. I think it's because ultimately we're talking about a practice or series of practices that aim to create versions of national identity in principle for overseas audiences. That is the way in which I see it. Potentially, one can look at the histories and see that nation branding emerges much more from the marketing literature, when at the end of the day, public diplomacy comes much more from international relations. But I'm not sure to what extent we're talking about different phenomenon. And also that allows us to situate, even though one can see the differences of some, an emphasis of some of these practices, one can put in a longer history and include propaganda as part of that. This is from a piece in which we co-wrote with Sabine, in which we discuss the origin of nation branding and how it emerged in a particular context. So it wasn't out of the blue. It was a context of neoliberal globalization, perhaps the peak of neoliberal globalization, the late 1990s, early 2000s, with the spread of satellite and digital technologies, and which, on one hand, it brought a lot of discourses about cosmopolitanism and globalization and so on, but also a lot of how we are seen, and we in inverted commas, by people overseas. And there was greater awareness of that. There was also the supposed triumph of neoliberalism, and how alternatives had to be left over, and that meant that all the solutions to any problems have to come from the market. And there was also the emergence of concepts like promotional cultures, the idea that promotional logics permeate, pervade, or invade different areas of society, and soft power. Many people forget that soft power was originally a concept that wanted to argue how, in a context in which the Soviet Union had disappeared, the United States could maintain its position as the global hegemon. And the original ideas of power was that the United States, in that context, had to rely not only in the economy, not only in weapons, but also in its supposed universal attractive values. Later on, the concept was seen as something that could be applied for other contexts, but it emerged out of the needs and interests of the United States. What is interesting is that the supposed answer to many of the challenges that neoliberal globalization posited was proposed as nation branding. So this idea that logics of branding could also be applied to nation states, and that would be the solution to attract tourism, to attract foreign investment, to attract good migrants, in inverted commas, to attract foreign businesses, and so on and so on. The context, of course, has radically changed nowadays. But it's interesting that nation branding so far remains, and one can find it even in Ukraine, how there have been nation branding campaigns that have to do with the war, and we try to garner support for against the invasion of Russia. The literature on nation branding is, generally speaking, instrumental. And you have titles like Competitive Identity by Simon Anholt, and those are titles that basically try to teach practitioners how to do a nation brand, and also try to justify why it's inevitable, it's necessary and positive to do this. And most of the literature, and that was one of the early observations that was made, remains in that field. But there is a growing set of critical literature that comes from media and communications, anthropology, sociology, and other fields that is trying to question and tries to like put a time out and try to identify issues like the power relations, the inequalities, and so on that can be perpetuated by nation branding. And an example of that is a book by Melissa Aronczyk, Branding the Nation. Generally speaking, the critique of nation branding emphasizes in economic over political interpretations. So again, generally speaking, the main argument is that nation branding is an expression of neoliberalism, and that nation branding, what it does is that it commodifies national identities. Also, another critique that is communicated is that it concentrates too much power in branding consultants. And basically the perspective is that the definition of what the nation is or should be is in the private sector instead of being in the public sector. Even though those critiques are very important and necessary, and they make really, really good points, quite often they overlook broader debates on power, on media, on nationhood, and contestation. Again, the main point that many of these critiques make is that nation branding is an expression of neoliberalism or is part of a neoliberalist takeover. And I feel that that is a critique that falls short into seeing what is actually happening with nation branding. Again, I am not totally rejecting it. I think part of it is quite right on those critiques, but it doesn't convey everything that is happening with nation branding. And part of that sensation led me and my colleague Pablo to start reading a little bit about nations and power. And I'm aware that I'm preaching to the choir here, but yeah, you all know that nations are abstract, and because they are abstract, they require of performance and symbols to become concrete. And within that, one of the many definitions of power that I found, I ended up using the one of John Thompson, partly because of the significance that he gives to the role of the media in modernity, when he defines it as the ability to act in pursuit of one's aims and interests, the ability to intervene in the course of events and to affect their outcome. What I found much more interesting was that when I was rereading the media in modernity, I found that he gave a typology of 4 types of power. We talk about economic, political, coercive, and symbolic, which to some extent resonates with some of other powers that I found in literature about nations and nationalism. Like Miguel Ángel Centeno and Maldonado have written about territorial, economic, infrastructural, and symbolic power. But what I found very interesting, again, is that some of these authors stress that even though all of these powers that they overlap with each other, of course, and even though all of these powers are important for states, states especially rely on coercive and symbolic power. And that's something I find like an interesting entry point to look at the media, but also to look more specifically at the significance of nation branding. Because again, given that nation states are that nations actually are abstract and they require to be performed and they require symbols to become tangible, this symbolic power becomes crucial. And something that I've been thinking a lot is that expanding the argument of Bever, that states not only have a monopoly on violence within a territory, but states also claim to have a monopoly on the communication and representation of the nation. So quite often states claim to be the voice of the nation, and states claim to be the rightful representatives of what a nation is or should be. But as you all know, Michael Billig has already stated in Banal Nationalism how the voice of the nation is a fiction and there are struggles, unsuccessful nations that die, but basically it is a fiction that creates this idea that the nation speaks with a single voice, when actually that is created, is manufactured, is an invention of the state. And this is at the core of the work that Sabine and Michael have conducted in mediated nationhood. So if we bring these ideas to nation branding, number one, that challenges the argument that it's amazing how dominant it is when I get out of my filtered bubble of academia, that many people still argue that nation branding is just a projection or a mirror of the real nation. And that's why, even though it might sound very obvious, I think it's important to repeat that. But actually, talking about nation branding is talking about a set of strategic communication processes that they're drawing on features considered by domestic political and economic elites as typically representative, aim to cultivate, disseminate, manage new or improve, and I put that in inverted commas, versions of national identity to advance economic or political goals. In simple terms, there is a creation of official versions of national identity sanctioned by the state. It could be with the help of branding consultants, it could be with the help of other actors, but ultimately they're sanctioned by political elites, and these versions are made to circulate overseas to advance specific agendas. Of course, boundaries tend to be blurred, so sometimes they have an internal effect, but at least the original aim, the original intention is that these versions are aimed for overseas audiences. And again, as I mentioned, it's an official version of national identity by the state with the occasional support of the private sector. And I emphasize a lot that it's not a projection of the real nation, that is just an official or state-sanctioned version of national identity, because that is a good reminder that there are alternative versions of national identity that exist and circulate. So this is one of many versions of national identity, perhaps one that has more resources, perhaps it's the one that has more weight, it's one that is accompanied and is held by coercive power, but again, it's not simply the mirroring or the projection of the supposed real nation. So what I find interesting is that many of these debates have ignored Latin America, especially in the realm of nation branding. Many of them have focused on Central and Eastern Europe. There's a big chunk of literature there. There is also some in Western Europe, a little bit in Asia. I've seen some specific cases in Africa, but not so much Latin America. And I think that Latin America is a very interesting place to look at for different reasons. The first thing is that it's very complex to define what Latin America is. There's no clarity whether Latin America is formed by different continents or is a region of the broader American continent, whether it's a linguistic area, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, definitions of Latin America talk a particular region, area of the world that shares a history of being colonized specifically by the Spanish and Portuguese Empire, although with presence of the British, Dutch, French, but a big chunk of it was under the domain of Spain and Portugal. And also, it's a place in which I really like what Nicola Miller once wrote, where theories of nationalism never fit completely, and that's why they're so interesting to look at them. So, for instance, quite often the discussions about the origins of nations, they're not really relevant in Latin America because those Latin American nations are effectively a product of modernity. Even though some of them, like Mexico or Peru, claim to have links to an ancient past, they effectively emerge after the 18th and more specifically in the 19th century, when there is a breakup. In the case of the Spanish Empire, there are some theses that claim that what actually was a civil war of the Spanish Empire that led to the different republics. Portugal is a different case in which there was a different process that led to emergence of Brazil, but still there are some traits, and that meant that states emerged first than the nations, like in other places in Europe, I'm aware, but perhaps this was much more evident, and how the elites that were in charge of the new republics, they had to invent the nationals, and they had to put together people that were from European descent, slaves, original indigenous inhabitants, plus migrants that came afterwards and convinced them that they were part of these nations. But also, Latin America has been characterized by something that Miguel Ángel Centeno calls the question of ¿qué hacemos con el pueblo?, which is what do we do with the people? So literature on nationalism in Latin America tends to agree that the idea of nationhood across Latin America as a generalized idea and feeling emerges only in the second half of the 20th century. That before that there was not an identification with the idea of the nation, and partly that the media and especially television was very helpful with that. So what happens with nation branding? First of all, Latin America has a contested relationship with neoliberalism. So on one hand, neoliberalism was put in practice first in Latin America, in Chile specifically in the 1970s, and then after Chile was the guinea pig, came Thatcher and Reagan. But at the same time, there are the cases of Cuba, and at different times Bolivia, Venezuela, Ecuador for a while, that have contested neoliberalism and had tried to put forward alternative projects. At the same time, Latin American identities from the very beginning that they emerged in the 18th and 19th century have been forged by the idea that they need the approval of European powers, originally from colonial powers, the British Empire, from the Spanish Empire, and throughout the 20th century that they need the approval of the United States. So that is something that several anthropologists and sociologists in Latin America have pointed out. What is interesting is that how quickly the ideas of practices of soft power, nation branding, and public diplomacy were embraced by Latin American governments. I told you earlier about Simon Anholt, that literatures of nation branding called the father of nation branding, even though currently rejects his association with nation branding, was hired, for instance, by the Chilean government, as you see in the photo there, but also by the Mexican government as his work consultant. He's been one of the many American or British consultants that have directly worked with Latin American governments. And again, some of the critiques that have been emerged is that this is part of the neoliberal takeover. And I found this summarized beautifully in a book that Petra Alderman wrote about Thailand, but I think that it can also be applied for the case of Latin America, that the assumption is that nation states, especially in the global south, adopt nation branding as a result of external pressures and imperatives such as economic globalization, international misconception, and reputation alignment. Again, the idea is that there is this international pressure, this global pressure that forces these countries that they do not have any agency, and they just they give up basically and embrace nation branding as part of their development strategies. And again, that resonates with the earlier critique that I told you about how nation branding is part of this neoliberal takeover. However, when I started reading literature on Latin America, I found that the picture was much more complex than that, because quite often these arguments about the neoliberal takeover, they talk that neoliberalism is growing and is expanding at the expense of the state, and states are disappearing, and that welfare states are also being reduced. And that is an argument that may have weight, perhaps, in some areas of Western Europe, but not so much in Latin America, where the welfare state has not existed. There has been a developmental state, a bureaucratic state, but not the welfare state. So I ended up finding a very interesting book by Maldonado, Centeno, Ferraro, and others that makes the argument that what has occurred in Latin America is the emergence of the neoliberal state. So basically what they say, first of all, they define neoliberalism as a political program that transfers economic power and control to private markets. But their argument is that the state has not retreated in Latin America, that actually it has been reconfigured, and power has changed. And in fact, their argument is that power has become even much more centralized in Latin America under the neoliberal state. There's a stronger executive power in comparison with previous periods. There's also technocratic isolation. So there is a series of policy experts, especially in economics, that become isolated from politics and isolated from the debate, and they cannot be questioned. Quite often, these experts are not elected either. And also, there are what they call power reforms. So there are swift and fast reforms, and quite often, because they are swift and fast, but they do not have a political support, they are the source of many problems. And partly that's why I explained neoliberalism has been so wobbly in Latin America. And even in Chile, that was quite often portrayed as the poster child of neoliberalism in Latin America. They have been questioning, especially since the protests of 2019. So I found this a very interesting viewpoint to start also looking at nation branding. So I met with Pablo, with my co-author, and we started re-examining our data. We both have conducted research on nation branding in different countries. So we put together our data, which have been interviews, documents, analysis of campaigns, and so on, starting in the mid-2000s and so on. And we look at material from Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Mexico, Peru, and Uruguay. And we started seeing several trends that I'm gonna briefly summarize, but happy to go more into detail with them. The first thing that we notice is that the key actor in all nation branding initiatives across Latin America has been the state. Yes, the private sector has played a key role in nation branding, especially when it was the takeoff of nation branding, the role of consultants like Simon Anholt or companies like Future Brand and so on has been very important, and some of them remain important, but the state has always been the driving force in Latin America. And we have seen that the trigger of many of these nation branding initiatives have emerged from ministers of foreign affairs or from offices of tourism, investment bureaus, and so on and so on. So again, the starting point in all the histories of nation branding in Latin America has not been the private sector just arriving, but actually the state triggering all these processes with the help of the private sector, but the state has always been at the core of it. And we notice how it's also been a tool for governments, as I'm going to talk in a second, in which they are targeting the world. But by the world, also it's important mentioning that even though these courses say that, oh, we're running this campaign for the world, actually their targets are always the United States, Western Europe, increasingly China, sometimes Japan, Korea, and some Latin American neighboring countries. But again, usually the core of these campaigns is targeted at the United States and Western Europe, no matter how much the world says. I never saw a campaign or initiative that was targeting Africa, for instance. We noticed three things. So number one, true, the economy was at the core of these efforts, and it was a strategy of economic development, especially in cases like Chile, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Mexico, and Ecuador. So that was usually the triggering of many of these initiatives, and what was used as the justification to embrace and adopt nation branding. And following this is based on some of the arguments that Sabina made in an article with Enrique Castillo. They approach nations at units of economic production, also terrains for foreign businesses and investments. So very much the campaigns seem to be quite similar in trying to attract investment, trying to attract all these foreign businesses and using the metaphors like the hub. We're going to be a hub for development in Latin America. And also specific industries and destinations are portrayed as nationally representative. Wine in Chile, copper, beef in Argentina, Machu Picchu in Peru as a destination, Copacabana, and so on and so on. However, we noticed that political goals were always part of these efforts. So it was never purely about the economy. In the case of Mexico, there was very much, partly because of the size of the country, trying to emerge a regional influence over the rest of Latin America. Also in the case of Brazil, but also both wanted to have global influence. In Brazil, it's well known that during one of the longer term foreign policies of the country is trying to get a permanent seat in the Security Council of the United Nations. And many of the campaigns also pointed to that. But not only on big countries like Mexico and Brazil this happened. Chile started embracing nation branding, or the first nation branding actions after the end of the dictatorship of Pinochet. And one of the reasons was trying to show that Chile had recovered democracy and it was a new country. So again, yes, the economy is always at the core, it's very important, but it's never only about the economy. We also notice that quite often these efforts were what we call nationless nation brands. So they were definitely top-down efforts. So they definitely emerged from political elites with the help of economic elites trying to do things. And they approach people as resources or stampers. So resources in terms that there were a lot of focus groups conducted or interviews with people and so on and so on. And the logic was that it was a way of trying to extract the supposed national essence to afterwards mobilize it. But also, increasingly, there have been specific efforts through online media, especially, to try to legitimize already taken decisions by asking people, for instance, to vote what is the logo of the country that you prefer. That was the case of Argentina not too long ago. Or in the case of Chile, that they give them a list of landscapes that are supposedly nationally representative and people can vote for them. And then those are used as part of the campaign. But also, nation branding campaigns have been used as disciplinary projects, especially in the case of Colombia and Peru, in which after they have done the process of identifying the supposed national essence, after they have come up with a campaign, quite often nation branding projects include an internal component in which they try to teach people locally what is the correct way to being a Colombian, the correct way to being a Peruvian, and so on and so on. They package that under the excuse that people will become brand ambassadors, but it's ultimately a disciplinary project to incentivize some behaviors and basically telling that there are some other ways of being that should not be allowed because they do not fit with the brand. But still, it's important to remember that historically Latin American states have been fragile. So, and that goes beyond nation branding. Latin American states, in order to maintain power, have required the help of landowners or of military oligarchies, and quite often the national armies emerge of those oligarchies. But also, many of the political projects in Latin America have failed, partly because of social movements, protests, unrest, and so on. And in the last few years only, there have been cases in Colombia, Brazil, Chile, Bolivia, and Peru. And in many of those cases, they have also had an effect on these branding campaigns. To give you one example, in 2021, Colombia was about to launch a branding campaign called The Most Welcoming Place on Earth, and they had to cancel that campaign because like a week or two after the branding campaign was launched, there were massive protests in the country that led to the cancellation of a football tournament. And also people were murdered by the military police, there were arrests and so on. So that was not sustainable. Again, people who were protesting were not doing it against the brand, but inevitably those actions and the fragility of Latin American states affects that. And also part of the fragility, we also saw it in the brands themselves. Because number one, states, yes, they define the legal, political, and economic frameworks where the brands operate. So it's not simply that consultants arrive and they can do whatever they want to do. They have a framework and they're constrained for the frameworks that political elites establish. But also we notice that the discourse of nation branding, every time that they launch a brand in any Latin American country, they said this is a cross-party, long-term promotional strategy, and so on and so on. But most of the campaigns, with the exception of Costa Rica and a little bit Uruguay, were quite fragile and fleeting. So we noticed that nation brands were always entangled with the agendas of specific governments. We saw that in Bolivia, for instance, the brand Corazón del Sur was very much associated with the government of Evo Morales, to the point that the colors of the brand, like the blue that you can see there, was the same blue of the political party of Evo Morales. And many of the colors that you see on the logo on top resemble the huipala, which is a flag that indigenous peoples in the Andes use, and that was part of the political project of Evo Morales. In Ecuador also, the recent government of Gustavo Noboa launched a new brand of Ecuador, claiming that the previous brand was too politicized, and that the new brand is neutral, but the new brand is very much aligned with the neoliberal policies of the current government. With Brazil has been interesting how during the Bolsonaro government there was a brand that was Brazil with Z for Brazil with S, that eliminated the previous brand of the Lula and Rousseff governments. And as soon as Lula came back into power, he returned to the previous brand, and so on and so on. And there are plenty examples of that. And partly that's also because when authorities fail, that often means the end of a nation brand in a country. When Morales had to resign for massive protests, especially after he tried to get change the constitution, the Bolivian constitution, to have continuous re-elections, that also meant the end of his brand. Also in Ecuador, when the more left-wing governments stopped being in power, that was also the end of the brand. I already told you Bolsonaro, and so on and so on. So this basically has been an entrenchment of nation brands and political projects. I find very interesting that when I've talked to nation branding practitioners about this observation, they have told me that that has been a mistake and a disruption. That nation branding is essentially neutral, that's their argument, and that's why you need to keep it away from politics. If I go back to the argument of the neoliberal state, centralized power, we see the same in nation branding. Technocratic isolation, we see the same. Power and reforms, we see the same, and also that's why it's the source of so many problems. So to start wrapping up, yes, nation branding is not just a marketing tool to manage images, but also I would argue that it's not just a mere neoliberal takeover. As Christine Egelin notes in her work on Kazakhstan, she says, what is branded is not the nation, but the state and the regime that rules it. So her argument is that nation branding is essentially political. It's not just economic. Again, it's not just like the capitalism taking over things. And that's why I would argue that nation branding is part of the symbolic arsenal of local elites to legitimize specific political projects. And if I bring Bourdieu, it's an attempt to naturalize a particular vision of the state and a vision in agreement with the interests and values associated. It's also a disciplinary practice that, again, seeks to impose specific versions of collective identities, but also of the world. So what are the gazes that matter and the ones that do not? But also it's essentially very fragile. And as you can see there in that illustration that I included there of how, in the case of Peru, that quite often branding practitioners say is one of the best cases of nation branding in Latin America for them, you still see resistance and you still have people internally contest the brand. So I'm going to leave it there, and thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing.
Many thanks, César. There is a question in the chat by Atsuko. Maybe you can go ahead and read the question. And meanwhile, I'm asking if there are other questions. I do have a question myself, but let me see if yeah, we have Sabina. So César, do you want to first read the question? Should I read it for you, or you have access to...
Yes, I can see it. So nationless nation brands. So nations do not exist a priori, but are created and gendered. Does it mean that nation branding, under some circumstances, top-down nation building? I would say in some circumstances, yes. Nadia Kaneva has a super interesting article about nation branding in Kosovo, and how in that case there was an explicit entanglement of nation building and nation branding. I would say that in the Latin American context for me, is part of the continuous reinvention of nations. So it's not only about the origin, but it's about how there is this idea that Latin American nations are always starting all over again. and they move from revolution to revolution, sometimes literally, sometimes not. And I think nation branding is definitely part of that. And I think it's a way of trying to justify sometimes those changes and to support those changes, and it's to support these political projects, even though it's always, every time that there is a new brand launch, it's always, oh, we're going to be apolitical, cross-party, long-term state interest, and so on and so on. So yeah, I definitely think that there is something there.
Thank you, Cesar. There is a question from Sabina.
Hi, Cesar. I found it really intriguing. Thank you for the presentation. To see how, you know, states really emerge in your talk as such important actors. And I see why you're arguing that. And in general, I think I agree that, you know, nation branding should be seen very much as a political project. And not just one driven by markets, partly because, as you clearly explain, neoliberalism is essentially, you know, it involves a political decision to structure the state in a way that enables market forces to an extent drive the show. But nonetheless, I'm wondering, you know, how this, you know, powerful role of the state that emerges from your talk relates to the fact that a lot of the, you know, mediation of nationhood these days happens through digital platforms that are obviously privately owned, they are transnational, except obviously in cases such as China. So how, you know, to what extent can a state really you know, use nation branding to discipline national imagination, to paraphrase your argument in such an environment? It clearly can in China to a degree, you know, even there, you know, there's cases where kind of nationalism kind of escapes, so to speak, top-down management. But yeah, I was just wondering, how do you square the two?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that that's a very good point. I think one needs to separate whether what the process of triggering and starting nation branding, and to what extent what they're doing is effective, successful, or whatever term that we want to use. I think that they have the power to start it, and they have still the resources to start this. To what extent do they succeed or not? I think in Latin America it has been quite contested, but I think it also depends with the moment in which they do it, and there's also something that has varied according to different countries. So with Pablo, we noticed, for instance, that in Peru there was an interesting embracement of the local embracement of one of the early nation branding campaigns, one that had the logo was the P of Peru, that used it resonated with kind of the Nazca illustrations, but with an at symbol. So it was trying to, again, mix technology with past and so on and so on. Locally, that campaign was seen, was entangled with an economic boom in Peru. And it was seen kind of like evidence locally that, oh, we are doing things well, therefore we deserve and we can have this nation branding campaign. In comparison, in Chile, the campaigns had never resonated that much locally, and people have very much rejected them. And there's very much this idea that we are really not that. And also, even within the same state, there have been disputes. So I think that the state can trigger these processes, but that doesn't mean that they're definitely going to succeed. And I'm thinking aloud now. Sometimes I wonder if one of the reasons why they're trying to increase control is precisely because they're increasing lack of control. Precisely because it's so difficult to control these narratives. Because also, if they had done nation branding in the 1970s or 1980s, they could have perfectly insulated people internally from these campaigns and told anything. And that's what happened with many tourism campaigns of different countries overseas. But nowadays people can see that, and as you correctly say, they don't have control over what the platforms show or not, and there's also a bigger potential of contestation. So I think that is, again, it's need to separate the beginning what was effectively happening afterwards. And I think that probably that also contributes to the fragility of many of these efforts.
Thank you, César. There is a question from Michael. Sorry, Sabina, you want to get back or to?
No, I just wanted to thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. There's a question from Michael is in the chat. He's traveling, so he cannot ask the question, but basically he's asking whether your argument applies only to fragile states or it can also be applied to other parts of the world. And he's mentioning in particular the examples of the US and Trump's apparent disregard for the brand of the US, I guess, nowadays. It makes also the example of changing branding from New Labour to Conservatives in the UK. Yeah,
that's an interesting question, because I got very inspired for this paper when I read the work of Christine Egelin and Petra Alderman. That Christine has looked at Kazakhstan and Petra has looked at Thailand. Their argument was that in authoritarian regimes, nation branding should be approached as a political tool. But their argument was only about authoritarian places, but authoritarian settings. But then when I started thinking of the relatively more democratic Latin America, I saw that the similar arguments could also be used there. So this is not only about strong state and authoritarian regimes in which they're trying to do this. Could it be applied to the US? That's a good question. Things that the US is a really weird place when it comes to nation branding, partly because of the size of the country, the influence of the country, and also because even though they had at some, and they still have it technically, the brand USA, it hasn't been as relevant as in other places, right? But also I think, and that's something that we have talked to Sabina, brands and images and so on are also very much relational, right? So a big chunk of people might consider that Trump is disregarding the brand of the US, but many other people are thinking that Trump is perfectly on brand and that what he's doing should be celebrated. And in the case of the UK, it's interesting because they have not changed that much the official nation branding campaign, which is the GREAT campaign, which is the one that you can see in airports or when you take the Eurostar. But they created at the beginning of last year an office for soft power and public diplomacy, which I know that are conducting research. I have not seen yet any significant changes on the narrative of the UK, but there's definitely something about politics there at the core. So potentially, I think that I'm not saying that you can just copy paste the same argument and apply it in these places, but there is something about it that maybe could be transposed to them.
Thank you, César. I do have, I'm not sure whether other people have questions. Maybe let me go ahead and then maybe there is so maybe, I don't know, maybe comments or something. Starting from the last point, the USA. If I think about USA and actually goes back, it's not really, it's more about the image, right? If I see any product, particularly sport apparel, they have the USA flag. I mean, that's good, it's positive, right? Despite any specific, intentional, explicit nation branding. So some nations come by default with a positive image. And I wonder what you make in relation to the nation branding. Because in this case, we don't have any specific campaign advertising things, but at the same time, it sells. If you go back to the importance of nation branding more on the economic side. So this is one point. The second point, you were mentioning about basically nation branding is for people outside the nation. But then when you go back to nation branding as a form of as politics, more than economics, you mentioned that the aim is to legitimize political projects. And I wonder, why does it matter to legitimize political projects outside the nation when actually what you want is to gain consensus within the nation? So we go back to the importance actually of a nation branding if it's understood politically, that matters for the people inside the nation more than for the outside the nation. And the last point, I think it goes back to what I find it somehow confusing by an ironic sense, because it's all about nation branding, but actually the brand is the state. You can call it the nation state, but if there is not, I'm thinking particularly about multinational states. I'm thinking, for instance, about Canada. And I remember there was an advertisement by Ontario, any other states. Actually, they bypass the nation and they go global and they try to advertise their own Ontario space in order to attract the capital there specifically. So going back to this point and talking about the plurality of the nation, you rightly mentioned that this is just one version of the nation. There are many, but I wonder, talking about geographical scales, so the actors involved in nation branding. I mentioned the example of Ontario, but I might think within a nation, maybe, I don't know, a specific city. And I wonder maybe these subnational actors, whether they go hand in hand with the campaign, the nation branding campaign of the state, whether sometimes the state might appropriate what positive might emerge from a campaign of a local actors, and they use that as a way of. So what are the relationships at the going beyond the national elites at the more subnational scales of different territories, that they compete, they can challenge, they questions, or actually, yeah, they can be used by the state in order to present, oh, look, even though it's just that little place, actually we use it instrumentally to present the whole nation in a positive light. Yeah, sorry, there are many points. So
yeah, I'm gonna start with the last one. I would say it's a bit of everything. There are some cases in which Rio de Janeiro is used to promote the full Brazil. You know, Olympics are usually about a city, but they're used by the state to promote a full nation. But I found much more interesting the other case that you were saying, when there are competitions and contradictions, like Canada, for instance. Some research has shown that, at least when it comes to education, the different provinces, they have had different policies of promotion to attract students, and they ended up competing with each other. But also, I find the UK a very interesting case that has been understudied, I think. I remember when in 2016, after the Brexit referendum, I was in Germany, and I saw on what used to be called Twitter ads in German of Scotland, of the Scottish government, saying, "Oh, Europe, we're very sorry. We're never going to leave you. We're always going to be with you." And that was a way, I think, of trying to do foreign policy without doing foreign policy, through the brand. So you can find sometimes contradictions, and there have been some unsuccessful attempts in Wales also doing like a nation brand that may contradict the one of the of the UK. Once I asked someone working at the Great Campaign what they thought, for instance, of what Scotland did, and their approach was like, "Oh yeah, that's troublemakers." So they, if it depended on them, they would like everyone to be aligned, but that is impossible. And I think there is sometimes a competition of international brands, not only in cases of multinational states, but also between cities and places and so on. In terms of like nation branding, I would say nominally for foreign publics, but the domestic factor is always there. And I would say that every now and then, that happens. I saw it in a few cases in Latin America. The external gaze is just a justification to do things internally. So the external gaze of what the world is saying about us is saying as this powerful neutral force, and that justifies what we're going to do internally. So because we need to be seen well by the world, we need to behave in this certain way. Because we need to be seen by the world, we need to justify this specific policy. So there's a lot of that, of using the world to justify something, also sometimes to contest. because the world is not understanding us and seeing our stereotypes, we need to show this thing. We need to do this thing. So it's not simply like passiveness of being observed, but it's a lot of the activeness of politically using and sometimes exploiting the idea of being seen. And the case of the United States, in the book that I wrote with Pablo Miño and FSBin, we had a little chapter about the US, and we wrote how it's a total outlier, that it doesn't correspond. The United States is very interesting because many of the experts on nation branding have emerged from there, but they don't work in the United States. They feel that they don't need to. And because of the size and influence, the United States is seen as the country that does not need a brand because it already has one. And that's why it's brand USA is not that significant within the United States because they have the industries, they have Hollywood, and so on and so on. But that makes it, I think, much more an outlier on other places. Like, I find interesting how Western European countries have also engaged with nation branding. And I think that the US probably is weird in the sense of, I'm trying to remember, Western educated, industrialized, I forgot the R, and democratic. So it's one of the weird nations in that way. But also that potentially the narrative of the perception that you mentioned may change at some point. I don't know. So nothing is written in stone that it always going to be seen as the United States as like the place. Like, I also think of the Made in China, how gradually has also been seen as something that is better, has improved in terms of technology.
Thank you, César. Is there any other questions in the room? I'm conscious of the time, but I'm just checking if there's any quick question or comments. It seems, it seems that it's time to thank you again, César. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. And the next LUNN talk would be with actually Michael Skay, and that's the end of April, 29th of April, and we'll be talking about flagging nations. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you again, César. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.